message to music, a message higher and larger, beyond all we can understand. Let your blood fill and your soul drain, because from your end will come new life and a new day. Die to yourself today and live beyond the night. Message to live beyond the night. Message to music.
Israel has approved plans for further settlement expansion in East Jerusalem. The announcement that 2,500 new homes will be built comes only hours before Prime Minister Netanyahu met with Barack Obama in Washington. The issue has long been a sticking point in peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians. Let's take a listen to how the White House spokesperson reacted.
The United States is deeply concerned by reports that the Israeli government has moved forward with the planning process in the sensitive area, in a sensitive area of East Jerusalem. This step is contrary to Israel's stated goal of negotiating a permanent status agreement with the Palestinians, and it would send a very troubling message if they were to proceed with tenders or construction in that area. This development will only draw condemnation from the international community, distance Israel from even its closest allies, poison the atmosphere not only with the Palestinians but also with the very Arab governments with which Prime Minister Netanyahu said he wanted to build relations.
To discuss this further, I'm joined live by Colin Cavell, professor at Bluefield State College in West Virginia. Thanks for joining us here on RT International. So Israel announced plans for further settlement expansion in East Jerusalem just before Netanyahu's meeting with President Obama. Do you think that's surprising, especially considering the Obama administration's stance on settlements?
Matt, no, it is not surprising. In fact, it is one more step in the defeat of Barack Obama. He has got 2 years left in his presidency, and he's already been backing down numerous times. And the 50-day Gaza war, Barack Obama could not do anything to stop Israel's slaughter of 2,100 Palestinians. He tried to prevent U.S. troops going into Syria and Iraq for the last 2 years. Israel tried to get them involved just earlier this year. Now, with the creation of ISIS, they finally got U.S. military equipment, drones, bombing Iraq, bombing Syria, and Israel and Saudi Arabia are collaborating to heighten this war, to fuel this war, and it all shows that Barack Obama has a weakness in his last 2 years in his presidency. He is capitulating.
The White House has warned that Israel that the latest project will distance it from close allies. Do you think the country's concerned about that?
Benjamin Netanyahu is not concerned about that at all, because the close ally that he is concerned about with, which many Americans are unaware of, is Saudi Arabia. Israel collaborates with the Gulf monarchs, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and they're the ones who have been fueling this war in the Middle East that is dragging the U.S. into it with military equipment. Barack Obama has refused for most of his term to engage in war in Iraq and in Syria and trying to pull the troops out of Afghanistan. They want to bring him back in, particularly Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham. But they are supported by the states of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel.
Now, Netanyahu has said that it's better to know the material before making these claims. Do you think it's one can assume that Israel is not going to back down from settlement expansion policies?
Israel has not backed down from settlement expansion policies for the last 20 years, so why should they start now with a very weak president?
How much of a barrier is this dispute then to a two-state solution?
Well, if you build a 2,500-unit housing complex and what the Palestinians consider the capital of their future state, then that's definitely a barrier to any type of peace accord. So Israel, as they've shown recently with the 50-day Gaza war, they have no desire for peace with the Palestinians. In fact, they only want to eliminate the Palestinians.
On May 16, 2011, the New York Times published an op-ed titled "The Long Overdue Palestinian State" by Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian National Authority. In that peace, Abbas called for the United Nations to formally recognize a Palestinian state based on the pre-1967 borders, regardless of negotiations with the State of Israel. The article appeared just a few days before Barack Obama's much-anticipated speech on the Arab Spring, in which the president also tried to jumpstart peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. To reach an agreement on a two-state solution, Obama declared, Israel must agree to return to the pre-1967 borders, modified only by mutually agreed land swaps. Now, neither Mr. Abbas nor Mr. Obama can explain how anyone could have recognized a United Nations designated Palestinian state that Palestinian leaders and the Arab states themselves have rejected. Of the troubles in Ireland, the poet William Butler Yeats once wrote, "Great hatred, little room, maimed us at the start." In Palestine at the start, there was plenty of room, more than enough room, for a prosperous Jewish state and a prosperous Arab state. After World War I ended, with the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations established the Mandate for Palestine, including all of the land that is now Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, plus the entire territory east of the Jordan River, now called the Kingdom of Jordan. The area under the Mandate was as large as Syria and about half as large as Iraq, yet the total population at the time was less than 1 million, of whom 10% were Jews. It was in that vast, underdeveloped and underpopulated territory that the British had promised in the language of the 1917 Balfour Declaration to support the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The declaration also promised that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Open Jewish immigration to the Holy Land was encouraged, as was freedom of speech, religion, and assembly for the Arabs of Palestine, rights they had sorely lacked under Turkish rule. Mired for more than 2 centuries in backwardness and grinding poverty, Palestinians were never recognized by the Ottoman Empire as possessing any distinctive national identity. The Palestinians quickly took advantage of their new freedom to speak bluntly, demanding a stop to the Jewish immigration which had just begun. Said one Arab representative during the Paris Peace Conference, "We will push the Zionists into the sea, or they will send us back into the desert." Aref Pasha Dajani, a Palestinian leader from Jerusalem, warned that it is impossible to live with the Jews. In all the countries where they are at present, they are not wanted because they always arrive to suck the blood of everybody. If the League of Nations will not listen to the appeal of the Arabs, this country will become a river of blood. Well, as promised, blood did flow when the Palestinian demand to end Jewish immigration was not granted. Jerusalem was the first flashpoint for regular Arab attacks on Jewish communities in April 1920. Palestinians from nearby towns poured into the old city. The Muslim mayor of Jerusalem and other notables worked up the crowd to launch a jihad against the Jews. "If we don't use force against the Zionists and against the Jews, we will never be rid of them," urged newspaper editor Arif al-Arif. The crowd shouted back, "We will drink the blood of the Jews," shouting Islamic slogans like "Muhammad's religion was born with the sword." Thousands surged through the Jewish quarter and into West Jerusalem. The mobs vented their rage against any Jew they could find, burning and looting homes and stores, and even attacking British and Arab policemen. After several days of rioting, the final toll was 6 Jews dead, hundreds beaten, and widespread destruction of property. What became known as the Nebi Musa riot was the opening shot in a 90-year war to reverse the Balfour Declaration. And things soon got worse as the Allies, to assuage the fears of Arab monarchs, separated the land east of the Jordan River out of the total area accessible to Jewish immigrants and created the Emirate of Transjordan. Reconciling the aspirations of Arabs and Jews became far more tenuous after the Balfour Declaration had to be carried out in the truncated area of Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. There was now much less room and a great deal more hatred. The decades that followed were marred by perpetual violence against the Jews both in Palestine and in Europe. The two were often linked. Under the leadership of the Grand Mufti and President of the Supreme Muslim Council, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Arabs of Palestine waged an endless jihad against their Jewish neighbors. When the British sent a royal commission to investigate a solution, the Jews, represented by Chaim Weizmann, pressed for a partition of the territory into two states, even if the territory assigned to the Jews was the size of a tablecloth. The Peel Commission's final report, published in July 1937, proposed such a division. The Jews were offered an independent state in a small enclave along the seacoast from Tel Aviv to the north of the country, constituting about 20% of the remaining mandate territory, while the Palestinian Arabs would get 80% for their own state. Desperate for any means to be able to bring in large numbers of the endangered European Jews, the Zionists reluctantly accepted the Commission's partition plan. Led by the Mufti, the Arabs rejected partition out of hand and pressed on with the armed revolt against the mandate. The British succeeded in putting down the violence for a time. Al-Husseini was sent into exile, ultimately in Hitler's Nazi Germany, where he lived as a special guest of the Führer. But severe limitations were placed on Jewish immigration to the Holy Land in the years leading up to the Holocaust that undoubtedly directly led to the death of many thousands of European Jews. Now, following the atrocities of the Second World War, Britain relinquished authority over the mandate to the newly formed United Nations. The UN created yet another commission to try to figure out what to do with the contested territory. The United Nations Special Committee on Palestine recommended, by a vote of 7-3, yet another two-state solution, another partition plan to the General Assembly. This plan would have seen the territory divided almost equally between Jews and Arabs. Once again, the Zionists made public their acceptance of the proposal, and once again, Arab officials announced that any partition would be met with rivers of blood. Shortly after the UN vote, the 20-member Arab League sent their newly organized Arab Liberation Army against the Jews of Palestine. Elements of 5 regular Arab armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded Israel on May 15, 1948. Arab League Secretary General Abdul Rahman Azam vowed, "This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongol massacres and the Crusades." But despite their overwhelming numbers and heated rhetoric, after a year of fighting, it was the Jewish state that had won a decisive victory. Based on the 1949 armistice lines, Israel's territory expanded by almost 40%. The Palestinian Arabs were the big losers. For the second time in 10 years, their leaders rejected a partition plan that would have given them independence and more land designated for their state than for the Jewish state. Instead, they ended up with nothing, and 650,000 Palestinians became refugees. Jordan's King Abdullah sent his Arab Legion to occupy the Palestinian West Bank and annex the territory to his kingdom. Egypt took the Gaza Strip and for the next 18 years denied Palestinians any civil rights. It never occurred to the rulers of Jordan or Egypt to create a state for the homeless Palestinians, nor did new Palestinian leaders like Yasser Arafat protest this occupation of their land by foreign rulers. Now, 3 times in the past decade, Israeli prime ministers have offered Palestinian leaders an independent state, far more generous than anything Jordan and Egypt ever allowed when they controlled the West Bank and Gaza. At Camp David in 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak agreed to the border suggested by President Clinton that would have established a West Bank Gaza Palestinian state with some territorial adjustments and with the Palestinians getting East Jerusalem as their capital. For his part, Palestinian Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat walked out of negotiations, went back home, and launched the Second Intifada. Invoking Islamic Jew hatred as justification, the Palestinians conducted a 3-year brutal campaign of suicide bombings against Israeli pizza parlors, wedding halls, and discotheques. In 2005, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon decided that it was against Israel's security interest to govern the 1.1 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Sharon dismantled all of the Jewish settlements and pulled Israeli forces back across the 1967 borders between Israel and Gaza without even any land swaps. As an added bonus, Israel left the Palestinians a thriving flour export industry to help jumpstart the local economy. The Palestinians' response to this generosity? Well, first they destroyed the donated greenhouses, and then they launched a war of missiles and rockets against civilian targets in Israel. In a September 2008 meeting in Jerusalem, then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert presented President Abbas with a detailed map of a future Palestinian state that, with land swaps, would constitute close to 100% of the territory of the West Bank and Gaza prior to the June 1967 war. Olmert also offered to divide Jerusalem, enabling the Palestinians to locate their capital in the eastern half of the city. Promising to come back the next day for further discussions, Abbas took Olmert's map to his Ramallah office, just a few miles outside Jerusalem, for his aides to study. But Abbas never returned with the map. This was the last time the Israeli and Palestinian leaders met. Many times over the last 63 years, both the international community and the State of Israel have offered the Arabs of Palestine their own state. Each time, these offers have been met by more violence against Jewish citizens. Neither President Abbas nor President Obama are ignorant of this fact. They simply both choose to ignore it. For Mr. Abbas, this refusal seems to be part of a consistent thread woven throughout the Arab war against the Jews. Mr. Obama's positions remain more mysterious.
Itself from hostile invasions and terror. Israel is a small state surrounded by Arab countries 650 times its size, some of which are large bases of global terror. Only 44 miles separate between the Jordan Valley and the Mediterranean Sea. After the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel was attacked by 4 armies on 3 fronts, United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 stated that Israel was entitled to new defensible borders to replace the previous fragile lines from which it was attacked. What are Israel's defensible borders? What are its essential security needs? The Jordan Rift Valley, Israel's eastern frontier, forms a natural barrier between Israel and the countries of Jordan, Iraq, and Iran. The Jordan Valley rises from an area that is 1,200 feet below sea level to a hilly ridge of up to 3,000 feet, creating a steep 4,200-foot virtual wall opposite any force attacking from the east. The growing threat of global jihad activity near Israel's borders requires it to prevent infiltrations of terrorists and weapons. When Israel left the Philadelphia corridor in Gaza, it became a highway for the infiltration of terrorists and the flow of hundreds of tons of ammunition and weaponry from all over the Arab world aimed at Israeli civilians. The Jordan Valley is the equivalent of Gaza's Philadelphia corridor in the West Bank. To defend itself, Israel must retain control over the Jordan Valley. This is Israel's mountain ridge, rising up to 3,000 feet. It dominates Israel's major coastal cities, where more than 70% of its population, 80% of its industry, and all of its airfields and seaports are located. Missiles launched from the Judean hills pose an immediate threat to Jerusalem, Israel's capital. Israel's only international airport, Ben Gurion, would be in the range of even primitive rockets, while all planes taking off and landing would be threatened by shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles. More advanced weaponry would be able to hit virtually any point in Israel. If Israel were forced back to the 1949 armistice lines, the Green Line, the country's width would be reduced to a narrow 9-mile waistline that would be impossible to defend. That's why any future arrangement must include Israeli control over key areas of the mountain ridge and a demilitarized Palestinian state. Israel's narrow borders means a combat aircraft can cross the entire country in under 4 minutes. In less than 2 minutes, an enemy plane could penetrate the country's airspace via the Jordan Valley and reach Jerusalem. In order to thwart an aerial attack on Jerusalem, a hostile plane must be shot down at least 10 miles east of the capital to prevent it from crashing into major population centers. Therefore, Israel must be able to identify hostile planes before they cross the Jordan River line and intercept them shortly after. To defend itself, Israel must control the airspace over the West Bank. Israel's transportation arteries, and in particular the Trans-Israel Highway, enable travel and connection between Israel's regions. They also assure the mobility of the Israel Defense Forces in case of attack. Protection of these vital arteries is essential in order to ensure that 1. Civilians aren't victims of terrorist gunfire. 2. Regions of the country cannot easily be cut off. 3. The mobility of Israel's defense forces is not hindered in the case of invasion. To defend itself, Israel must control its main arteries of transportation. There is enormous uncertainty about future trends in the Middle East. Iran is determined to become the supreme power as the U.S. withdraws from Iraq. No one can guarantee the future of many of the current regimes in the region. Today, more than ever, it is crucial to ensure defensible borders for Israel.
The Arab-Israeli conflict is presented in the media as a territorial dispute. A common argument asserts that in the territory of the present state of Israel, there used to reside a 1,000-year-old Arab-Palestinian people, which was forcibly evicted by the Zionist Jews. In order to evaluate these claims, we must examine the historical facts. We shall do this in what follows. It was the Romans who, in the 2nd century of the Common Era, first used the name Syria-Palestina for Jerusalem and surrounding areas. It was an incorrect usage. In Greek, Palestina means homeland of the Philistines, but the Philistines never occupied more than a tiny sliver on the eastern Mediterranean coast, including part of what is today's Gaza Strip, and they had ceased to exist centuries earlier. The Romans had conquered a place called Kingdom of Judah, and they themselves, after possessing it, called it Province of Judea. Both names mean homeland of the Jews. Why then did the Romans change the name to Syria-Palestina? This is an important question. Jewish community and religion are organized around the law of Moses, which, according to Exodus, was born in an Egyptian slave revolt. This explains why the law of Moses denounces oppression and protects the poor. It also explains the preoccupations of the Roman military aristocracy. In those days, the Jews were a very large population distributed throughout the Mediterranean. The greatest worry of the Romans was that the popularity of the law of Moses among the oppressed peoples of the empire might result in revolution. In order to avoid such an outcome, the empire launched enormous mass killings of Jews, remembered today as the First Jewish War, the Diaspora Revolt, and the Second Jewish War. According to historians, taken together and in proportional terms, the Romans killed perhaps more Jews than did Adolf Hitler. Once the genocide had been concluded, Emperor Hadrian, after destroying Jerusalem in the 2nd century, brought Greeks to settle it and forbade the entrance to Jews under pain of death. The city was renamed Aelia Capitolina and the area Syria-Palestina. In political terms, Palestine means there are no Jews here, nor do we allow them. Some Jews stubbornly remained in their Holy Land, and many others soon returned. The Romans informally continued to call the place Judea. With the passing of the centuries, the name Palestine was used less and less and ceased to have a clear referent. Under the Turkish Ottoman Empire, overlord of the area from the 16th century, there was no administrative or political entity called Palestine. In the 20th century, after wrenching the Middle East from the Turks in World War I, the British revived the name when they created the British Mandate for Palestine. But their final definition of Palestine in 1922 was just 1/4 of the landmass that they themselves had baptized Palestine 2 years before. Such arbitrariness supports the complaint of Arab historian Philip Hitti, who testified in 1946 before the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry that there is no such thing as Palestine in history. Absolutely not. But if the name Palestine is an artificial creation of the Roman Empire, and later of the British Empire, then who are the so-called Palestinians? That question was answered by Zahir Muhsin, the chief of military operations of the Palestine Liberation Organization. or the PLO, now better known as the Palestinian Authority. In an interview with Dutch magazine Trouw, Hussein explained, "We are all part of one people, the Arab nation. We are one people. Just for political reasons, we carefully underwrite our Palestinian identity, because it is of national interest for the Arabs to advocate the existence of Palestinians to balance Zionism. Yes, the existence of a separate Palestinian identity exists only for tactical reasons. The establishment of a Palestinian state is a new tool to continue the fight against Israel and for Arab unity." Why does Hussein say, "a new tool to continue the fight against Israel"? In war after war, the combined efforts of several Arab Muslim states were defeated by tiny Israel, again and again. So a new tool was needed, a political warfare strategy that combined terrorism with diplomacy to achieve what open warfare could not. But is Zahir Hussein saying that a Palestinian people with a presumed right to the land of the Jewish state was simply invented? The PLO charters appear to confirm this. In its first charter, dated 1964, the PLO defined Palestine in Article 2 with its boundaries at the time of the British Mandate. This is a reference to the second arbitrary definition of the British from 1922. How can a 20th century foreign colonial power arbitrarily define the boundaries of the supposedly ancestral land of the Palestinians? But in truth, the PLO did not even really adopt the British definition. In Article 24, the PLO explicitly asserted that Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, the territories which it now claims for its desired state, were not Palestinian. Article 24. This organization does not exercise any territorial sovereignty over the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, or on the Gaza Strip. In 1968, the PLO rewrote its charter. This time, the definition of Palestine did not exclude Gaza, Judea, and Samaria, so the PLO was now claiming these territories. What explains the change? In 1964, when the PLO wrote its first charter, Egypt was illegally occupying Gaza, and Jordan was illegally occupying Judea and Samaria. But then the Arab states provoked the War of 1967, or Six-Day War, in which the Israelis captured the territories of Gaza, Judea, and Samaria, among others. It was after this that the PLO rewrote its constitution in 1968, this time including Gaza, Judea, and Samaria in its definition of Palestine. The borders of Palestine are therefore flexible and are redrawn to surround exactly the territory which Israel controls. In other words, the borders of Palestine are chosen merely so that it can be used as a tool to continue the fight against Israel. But if Palestine is a recent invention, and the same goes for the Palestinian identity, then where do the Arab Muslims now calling themselves Palestinian come from? Today, about 8 million people live in Israel. But the most reliable estimate about the 19th century puts the population of this area at 300,000. It was practically empty. And that is how 19th century travelers described it. For example, in the mid-19th century, the British consul complained that the area was empty of inhabitants. When Mark Twain visited, he remarked that in the Jezreel Valley there wasn't a single village to be found for 30 miles all around. And a visiting French author, Pierre Loti, wrote that cities and palaces had turned to dust. In a historical study, Karl Hermann Voss explained all this as a result of the Arab-Muslim conquest. In the 12.5 centuries between the Arab conquest in the 7th century and the beginnings of the Jewish return in the 1880s, Palestine was laid waste. Its ancient canal and irrigation systems were destroyed, and the wondrous fertility of which the Bible spoke vanished into desert and desolation. Under the Ottoman Empire of the Turks, the policy of desfoliation continued. The hillsides were denuded of trees and the valleys robbed of their topsoil. And the few people who lived there, who were they? A majority were Muslim, but they were divided by various identities, some of them violently opposed to each other, and none of them Palestinian. There were also small Jewish communities in the large settlements and in the villages of Galilee, and also large populations in Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias. In Jerusalem, in fact, the Jews were a majority. A document from the British consulate dated 1859 states, "The Muslims of Jerusalem do not exceed a fourth of the entire population." In 1878, 2 years before the Zionist migrations began, the Ottoman Sultan launched a resettlement policy to bring foreign Muslims, mainly Circassians and Algerians. Historian Arnold Blumberg explains, after 1880, the forces of nascent Jewish nationalism, foreign Muslim colonization, sponsored by the Turks, and spontaneous Arab immigration prompted by the new prosperity of Palestine changed the demographic face of the land. Given that starting in 1878, enormous waves of Muslim immigration began arriving in what was essentially an empty territory, it is obvious that the vast majority of those now calling themselves Palestinian do not have thousand-year-old roots in the place. This is confirmed by the UN's behavior, for it has defined a Palestinian refugee as any non-Jew who left during the War of 1948 and whose family had been residing in the area even just 2 years before them. Without such a definition, the population of so-called Palestinian refugees would dwindle almost to nothing. Now then, everybody recognizes that the Zionist Jews settled mostly on barren lands that nobody was using. The very King Abdullah of Transjordan, who would participate in the effort to destroy the nascent Jewish state in 1948, wrote in 1946, "I was astonished at what I saw of the Jewish settlements. They have colonized the sand dunes, drawn water from them, and transformed them into a paradise." The Jewish recovery of the land produced an economic explosion that attracted many Arabs from neighboring countries looking for a better life, and they fattened the numbers of those who would later call themselves Palestinians. Many believe, however, that the Zionist Jews stole the lands upon which they settled, using force. Did they? That question was answered by Haj Amin al-Husseini, the father of the Palestinian movement. In 1936, Husseini, Mufti of Jerusalem, launched his fourth great terrorist assault against the Jews of British Mandate Palestine. He called it the Arab Revolt. This violence lasted until 1939. In 1937, the British government sent a team to investigate, headed by Lord Peel. His mission was to establish what was happening and why. He called Husseini as witness. Sir Laurie Hammond asked Husseini whether the problem was that Jews had taken Arab lands by force. Husseini replied, "In most cases the lands were acquired. I mean forcibly acquired. Compulsory acquisition, as land would be acquired for public purposes." "No, it wasn't." "Not taken by compulsory acquisition?" "No." "But these lands amounting to some 700,000 dunams were actually sold?" "Yes, they were sold, but the country was placed in such conditions as would facilitate such purchases." "I don't quite understand what you mean by that. They were sold. Who sold them?" "Landowners." "Arabs?" "In most cases, they were Arabs." "Was any compulsion put on them to sell? If so, by whom?" "As in other countries, there are people who by force of circumstances, economic forces, sell their land." The Arab landowners who, according to Husseini, had been forced to sell their lands were the Effendi, the great feudal lords of the area. They did whatever they liked. Nobody forced them to sell. And they had sold their least productive lands at very high prices. In fact, Husseini's own family, among the largest Effendi landowners, was doing a brisk business with these sales. The Husseinis first would threaten the small landowners with death if they dared commit the so-called national crime of selling land to Jews. Then they would buy these plots at fire sale prices, consolidate them, and resell them at extortionate prices to the Zionist Jews. Historian Nathan Weinstock explains, in other words, hyper-nationalist propaganda became a lucrative industry, indeed even an American-style racket, for the Arab gentry. To conclude, it is false to say that a 1,000-year-old Palestinian people had its ancestral land taken by force by the Zionist Jews. First, because there was no such Palestinian people in the land, and second, because the Zionist Jews bought their lands from willing Arab landowners at prices well above the usual market rate.
Over 2,600 years have elapsed since the prophet Daniel predicted a peace treaty between Israel and the end times man of sin.
Some see Obama's push to force Israel into a Middle East peace agreement as a fulfillment of ancient biblical prophecy. Many fear what happens next could result in World War III.
But Daniel warned the peace covenant would be deceptive and would lead to desolation.
Just last week, Israeli government expressed anger over learning the United States had been gathering intelligence on them through the NSA.
Another intelligence officer was assassinated this week, reportedly for obtaining information regarding the new peace deal. Some are pointing fingers at authorities within the United States government.
And in that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces. Though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it, it shall come to pass in that day that I will destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem.
The U.S. ambassador and 3 other Americans dead. First ambassador murdered on the job in a generation.
Fires of anti-Americanism are burning around the world tonight.
Comes the compelling report revealing for the first time what New York Times best-selling author Tim LaHaye says is the deepest analysis of end times prophecies on what is about to happen next.
And amid the chaos, clashes are on the rise, with Coptic Christians facing increased violence.
Thousands continue to demand justice, and Christians say they will continue to protest until the government acts.
In our time, the biblical prophecies are being realized.
Did you know that there are very specific prophecies in the Bible concerning Israeli military strength in the end times? And did you know that those prophecies are being fulfilled today, indicating that we are living in the season of the Lord's return?
The focus of end-time Bible prophecy, as all of you know, is the nation of Israel. And that is the reason that the establishment of the nation of Israel on May the 14th, 1948 is so important. It is the event that signaled the fact that we are now living in the end times. Now, during the 20th century, we have been privileged. Pastor Jeffress mentioned this. We are living in a very dark time, but we're privileged to be living in a time when we are seeing Bible prophecies fulfilled before our very eyes. And there are 7 prophecies that I believe are in the process of being fulfilled in the Jewish nation right now that we are having the privilege of seeing. The first is the regathering of the Jewish people from the 4 corners of the earth. This was prompted by Theodore Herzl's book, The Jewish State, which was published in 1896. There were 40,000 Jews in all of Israel in 1900. Today, there are slightly more than 6 million Jews in Israel. The second is the reestablishment of the State of Israel, which occurred in Tel Aviv in a small room there on May the 14th, 1948. The third is the reclamation of the land of Israel. When the Jews started returning the land in the early 20th century, it was a malaria-infested swampland, and the highlands were all completely denuded of the trees. There were only 15,000 trees left in all of Israel. This picture taken right outside of Jerusalem showed how barren the land was. Today, Israel is the breadbasket of the Middle East, and its forests have been replanted. The fourth prophecy being fulfilled is the Hebrew language, the revival of the Hebrew language. In Zephaniah 3 and Jeremiah 31, we're told that when the Jews were scattered, when the Jews are brought back into the land, they will start speaking biblical Hebrew once again. The language that God had given them, they stopped speaking for almost 2,000 years. I don't know if you're aware of that, but wherever they went, they took Hebrew and they mixed it with the language, and they ended up speaking really 2 major languages. They mixed Hebrew with German and developed Yiddish, and they mixed Hebrew with Spanish and developed a language called Ladino. But when they came back to the land, They are today speaking not just Hebrew, but biblical Hebrew. And the person who was responsible for that is this man, Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was born in Lithuania and raised up by God to revive the Hebrew language. He did it almost single-handedly. He was a fanatic. That's all he focused on his entire life. And 6 months before he died, he was allowed to live long enough to see the British adopt 3 languages as the official languages of Israel in 1922. One was Biblical Hebrew, another Arabic, and the third English. That was in 1922. Now, the 5th of these is the reoccupation of the city of Jerusalem. And this is prophesied over and over that in the end times the Jews will reoccupy the city. And that was accomplished on June the 7th, 1967, when they reconquered the old city and rushed to the Wailing Wall to praise God and thank Him for their victory. And as they were praying, this man, Rabbi Sholem Goram, came up to the wall. And Rabbi Sholem Goram blew a shofar, and when everybody stopped praying and looked around, he said, "I proclaim to you the beginning of the Messianic age," because he knew that the prophecies say that when the Jews are back in the land and back in the city of Jerusalem, the Messiah will come. The 6th is the resurgence of the Israeli military, the resurgence of the military. And let me tell you something, this is a remarkable miracle. I got on the internet the other day to check this out to make sure, and all of the groups, the research groups that rank military power in the world, all of them rank Israel as between number 10 and number 15 in the world right now. And this, we're talking about a nation that's only 300 miles long and only 75 miles wide. It's one of the smallest nations in the world, and yet it's one of the world's great military powers. In fact, they not only rank it that high, but most of them rank it number 1 in the effective use of its power. And then number 7 would be the refocusing of world politics upon the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. The Bible says in the end times this will be the last of the prophecies fulfilled about Israel, that all the nations of the world will come against Israel for the purpose of forcing them to give up the city of Jerusalem. And today the whole world is in the process of doing that. The prophet Ezekiel prophesied that the revival of Israel in the last days would produce an exceedingly great army. Zechariah was more specific. He prophesied that God would make the clans of Judah like a firepot among pieces of wood and a flaming torch among sheaves, enabling them to consume on the right hand and on the left all their enemies. He proceeded to state that in the end times that the nation would be so strong that the feeble among them in that day would be like David against Goliath, and the house of David would be like God, like the angel of the Lord before them. Those are the prophecies about the resurgence of the Israeli military in the end times. Now what I'd like to do is look at the evidence of the fulfillment of these prophecies, and let's begin with the War of Independence that really started in November of 1947 and continued until March of 1949. On November the 29th, 1947, 50 years after Herzl said within 50 years there will be a state of Israel, 50 years later on this date, the United Nations adopted a resolution providing for the end of the League of Nations mandate in Palestine, replacing British rule with a partition of the land between the Arabs and the Jews. The Jews worldwide began to celebrate, even though the piece of territory they were provided was minuscule compared to what they had been promised by the British in the Balfour Declaration in 1917. There was rejoicing in Israel. There was rejoicing all over the world. This picture was taken in New York City, but the Arabs were outraged because they wanted all of it. They didn't want a part of it. They wanted all of it, and they certainly did not want a Jewish state. The result was the immediate launching of a civil war as the Arabs began to attack Jewish communities. This bloody conflict continued right up to the very day that the Jews issued their Declaration of Independence on May the 14th, 1948. As that epic day approached, the Arabs issued repeated warnings that they would launch an all-out war if the Jews tried to establish a nation. For example, this man was the Secretary General of the Arab League, a man by the name of Azam Pasha, and he declared, "It will be a war of annihilation. It will be a momentous massacre in history that will be talked about like the massacres of the Mongols or the Crusaders." On the Jewish side, there was considerable concern that such boasting could become a reality. In fact, on the eve of the war, Yagil Yadin, the chief of staff of the Israeli forces, told David Ben-Gurion, the Jewish leader, the best we can tell you is that we have a 50-50 chance. Within hours of the Declaration of Independence on the afternoon of May 14th, 1948, 5 Arab armies began invading the new nation of Israel. They consisted of Egypt coming from the south, Transjordan from the east, Syria from the northeast, Lebanon from the north, and Iraq from the far north. The Israeli forces consisted at most of 30,000 ragtag underground fighters who were ill-trained and poorly equipped. I mean, this picture here is just almost laughable. This was the army of Israel. The Israeli Defense Force, known as the IDF, was not organized until after the invasion. The Arab armies, on the other hand, particularly the Jordanians, were well equipped and trained. Egypt, Iraq, and Syria had air forces. Egypt and Syria had tank forces. All of them had modern artillery. The troops of Transjordan were led by a British general by the name of John Glubb, better known as Glubb Pasha. Although the United States had recognized the state of Israel immediately and given them great hope by doing so, the Truman administration did not provide any aid whatsoever. Truman declared an arms embargo under the naive assumption that if they supplied arms, there would be bloodshed. And he thought, well, if we don't supply any arms, if we just have an embargo, there won't be any bloodshed. Well, there was going to be bloodshed. There was no doubt about it. Meanwhile, the British gladly supplied the Arab forces, and while Israel had to smuggle in arms from Czechoslovakia. But despite the overwhelming odds against them, the infant Jewish state prevailed. The cost was enormous. There were 6,377 Israelis killed in this war of independence, representing nearly 1% of the total population. There were only 650,000 people in Israel at that time. This would be equivalent to the United States today losing 3 million people in a war. But the Israelis ended up not only with the territory that had been allotted them by the United Nations, they also ended up in control of 60% of the area that had been promised to the Arabs. And the Arabs suffered much greater casualties. Over 15,000 were killed during that war. They ended up with only 22% of the territory they had been promised by the United Nations. They would have been much better off to have accepted the United Nations division of the land. This is the reason that one of the greatest diplomats that Israel has ever produced, Abba Eban, said once, the Palestinians have never missed a chance to miss a chance. They never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They just over and over and over, they've had many opportunities to establish a state, and they just miss it every time. The most important area that the Israelis were not able to conquer in the War of Independence was the old city of Jerusalem, which is outlined there. The ancient city, the walled city, they were not able to conquer. In fact, all the Jews were expelled, and they stayed expelled for a number of years thereafter. Overall, the war resulted in an incredible, unbelievable, marvelous victory for Israel. And during the war, there were many miraculous events. I want to tell you about one that you will just hard to believe. It occurred at a kibbutz called Yad Mordechai, which is located 36 miles south of Tel Aviv near the northern border of the Gaza Strip. This kibbutz is located on the coastal road from Egypt to Tel Aviv. The Egyptian army, consisting of 5,000 troops, divided as it headed north. Half of the troops headed for Jerusalem. The other half of the troops went up the coastal highway toward Tel Aviv until they reached that spot there, the kibbutz of Yad Mordechai. Now, the kibbutz evacuated all of its children and most of its women as they prepared for the Egyptian attack. The kibbutz was left with a handful. Look at this boy on the left. He's probably not more than 13 or 14 years old. This man in the middle, the leader, was an intellectual. He was not a fighter. He was not a person who was a military. He didn't know what he was doing. I wouldn't want to tangle with the guy behind him who's got the stare. I don't look at it. But anyway, the kibbutz was left with 130 defenders against the Egyptian army. There were 110 kibbutzniks, and there were 20 fighters who came down from Tel Aviv. That's all they could get because everyone knew this particular kibbutz was going to be slaughtered. Here is the frightening scene, or rather they dug trenches and reinforced them with sandbags. This is one of the most marvelous places I've ever visited in Israel. These are the actual remains of that battle. The kibbutzim, they dug these trenches, they reinforced them with sandbags. Their armament consisted of this: 37 rifles, 1 anti-tank gun, 2 light mortars, and 2 machine guns. That's all they had. Here is the frightening scene they faced as the Egyptian army and tanks approach. What they've done today is they've left the vehicles that the Egyptians could not take with them, and they've put up metal figures to illustrate the army coming. And here they were with these primitive weapons up here in the trenches against the Egyptian army. There was no hope for the kibbutz. Everyone knew that. They knew that this was a suicide mission, but they were willing to take a suicide stand. The Egyptians attacked furiously with ground troops, tank assaults, artillery barrages, and air sorties. Incredibly, the Yad Mordecai defenders held out for 5 days. The Egyptians were not able to overrun the kibbutz until the defenders decided to retreat under the cover of darkness, because more than one half of them had been killed and the other half had been wounded. Over 300 Egyptian soldiers died in the battle, and the 5 days gave the defenders of Tel Aviv the time to prepare their defenses. Also, during that time, 4 Messerschmitt airplanes had arrived from Czechoslovakia and had been hastily assembled. They were used on May the 29th to stop the Egyptian army before it could reach Tel Aviv. How in the world could 130 untrained civilians with only rudimentary armament hold off the Egyptian army for 5 days? No one to this day has ever been able to explain it. It had to be a miracle of God. So what does all this mean to Christians at the beginning of the 21st century? What does it mean to you and me? What message should we take home? Well, I can assure you it means a lot. Think about it. God is fulfilling promises he made to Israel over 2,000 years ago, and he is fulfilling them in precise detail. That should get you excited for 2 reasons. First, it is a definite sign that we are living in the season of the Lord's return. Second, it should assure you that God is going to precisely fulfill every promise he has made to you and to me, to his church. I get so excited every time I see God fulfilling promises to the Jews, because I know that is an absolute guarantee he's going to fulfill every promise he has made to you and me. He has promised that one day very soon Jesus will appear in the heavens to rapture the church out of this world. The dead in Christ will be resurrected first. Then those of us who are alive will be taken, not even experiencing death. We'll be translated from mortal to immortal in the blinking of an eye. We'll be taken back to heaven, where we will be judged of our works to determine not our salvation but our degrees of reward. And then we will celebrate our union with Jesus at a great wedding feast. And at the end of that wedding feast, he's going to stand up and say, okay, let's go. And he will return to this earth, and we will come with him. We will be there in Jerusalem to witness his arrival on the Mount of Olives. We will be there to witness the salvation of the remnant of the Jews. We will hear him speak that supernatural word which will result in the instantaneous destruction of the Antichrist and his armies, and we will then shout, Hosanna, Hosanna, as he descends into the Kidron Valley on his white horse and rides up to that eastern gate.
Israel collaborates with the Gulf monarchs, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and they're the ones who have been fueling this war in the Middle East that is dragging the U.S. into it with military equipment. Barack Obama has refused for most of his term to engage in war in Iraq and Syria and trying to pull the troops out of Afghanistan. They want to bring him back in, particularly Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham. But they are supported by the states of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel.
Now, Netanyahu has said that it's better to know the material before making these claims. Do you think it's one can assume that Israel is not going to back down from settlement expansion policies?
Israel has not backed down from settlement expansion policies for the last 20 years. So why should they start now with a very weak president?
How much of a barrier is this dispute then to a two-state solution?
Well, if you build a 2,500...
It's a message to music, a message higher and larger, beyond all we can understand. Let your blood fill and your soul drain, because from your end will come new life and a new day. Die to yourself today and live beyond the night. Message beyond the night. Message music.
Israel has approved plans for further settlement expansion in East Jerusalem. The announcement that 2,500 new homes will be built comes only hours before Prime Minister Netanyahu met with Barack Obama in Washington. The issue has long been a sticking point in peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians. Let's take a listen to how the White House spokesperson reacted.
The United States is deeply concerned by reports that the Israeli government has moved forward with the planning process in the sensitive area, in a sensitive area of East Jerusalem. This step is contrary to Israel's stated goal of negotiating a permanent status agreement with the Palestinians, and it would send a very troubling message if they were to proceed with tenders or construction in that area. This development will only draw condemnation from the international community, distance Israel from even its closest allies, poison the atmosphere, not only with the Palestinians, but also with the very Arab governments with which Prime Minister Netanyahu said he wanted to build relations.
To discuss this further, I'm joined live by Colin Cavell, professor at Bluefield State College in West Virginia. Thanks for joining us here on RT International. So Israel announced plans for further settlement expansion in East Jerusalem just before Netanyahu's meeting with President Obama. Do you think that's surprising, especially considering the Obama administration's stance on settlements?
Matt, no, it is not surprising. In fact, it is one more step in the defeat of Barack Obama. He has got 2 years left in his presidency, and he's already been backing down numerous times. And the 50-day Gaza war, Barack Obama unit housing complex, and what the Palestinians consider the capital of their future state, then that's definitely a barrier to any type of peace accord. So Israel, as they've shown recently with the 50-day Gaza war, they have no desire for peace with the Palestinians. In fact, they only want to eliminate the Palestinians.
On May 16, 2011, the New York Times published an op-ed titled "The Long Overdue Palestinian State" by Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian National Authority. In that piece, Abbas called for the United Nations to formally recognize a Palestinian state based on the pre-1967 borders, regardless of negotiations with the State of Israel. The article appeared just a few days before Barack Obama's much-anticipated speech on the Arab Spring, in which the president also tried to jumpstart peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. To reach an agreement on a two-state solution, Obama declared,
Obama could not do anything to stop Israel's slaughter of 2,100 Palestinians. He tried to prevent U.S. troops going into Syria and Iraq for the last 2 years. Israel tried to get them involved just earlier this year. Now, with the creation of ISIS, they finally got U.S. military equipment, drones, bombing Iraq, bombing Syria, and Israel and Saudi Arabia are collaborating to heighten this war, to fuel this war, and it all shows that Barack Obama has a weakness in his last 2 years in his presidency. He is capitulating.
The White House has warned that Israel that the latest project will distance it from close allies. Do you think the country's concerned about that?
Benjamin Netanyahu is not concerned about that at all, because the close ally that he is concerned about with, which many Americans are unaware of, is Saudi Arabia.